Hello, I'm Anavultus, and today I'm here to discuss some ideas regarding political spectrums. And I have a special guest with me, one I've known for quite some time, and I think he's got some pretty interesting ideas on the topic. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, so online I'm known as Perceval. I created my own theory on how to categorize political ideologies. And with that, I made my own online political test, which people can take, and then they can find themselves on this platform that I made, so people can align themselves politically. And today we are discussing my theory, essentially. Now, this theory is called the four-pillar theory, which basically refers to the four spectra or pillars of what I like to call the four aspects of a society. First one being the political spectra, which from left wing to right wing, for me, determines how centralized or decentralized the political power is, which I like to see as a mixture of different elements that individuals hold within a society, such as the authority or the responsibility or protection or suffrage or morality or legislation or order that they might possess. And it ranges from statism to naturalism to me, where statism is where the political power is most centralized, naturalism is where it is most decentralized. The next spectrum that I use is the economical one, again, ranging from centralization, which would be centralism to me, all the way to the decentralization part, which would be privatism. And then the economical power that citizens hold are the growth, value, property, choice, wealth, and competition, and efficiency that they hold in themselves and all their belongings and economical conduct that they might have. The third spectrum is the social spectrum, which ranges from collectivism to individualism. This basically looks at how centralized or decentralized the social identity is of citizens, which may refer to their appearance, desires, opinions, personality, interests, abilities, and experiences that individuals of the society might hold. And lastly, we have the cultural spectrum, which ranges from globalism to localism, basically looking at how centralized or decentralized the cultural identity is of the individuals in the society, looking at aspects such as the language the individuals might speak, the aesthetics of the architecture, the cuisine, the food they might eat, the worldview they have, looking at their community in regards to the world, traditions they might hold, gestures or cultural body language or cultural principles. So these four spectra to me, these four pillars together, to me, are like the theoretical, simplified version of how a society looks like. And then, judging on the position that people take on these four spectrum, I can categorize them on this 2D figure that I have made. And it basically shows where people are politically aligned.
Yes, I'm showing it now.
Okay.
Yeah. And I've been showing it as you were discussing the ideas in relation to it. But I see that a general theme here is that is common between the four different pillars is centralization versus decentralization, and they tend to be four different types of centralization versus decentralization.
Mhm. Yes. So the basis of my theory, as you said, right? I look at left wing as the centralization of all of these aspects, and right wing as the decentralization. Um, in a given society, in a given group of people living together on an area, um, I look at a vertical and a horizontal hierarchy. And then the vertical, of course, is the amount of political or economical power that people might have. And the horizontal hierarchy is then the different social or cultural identity that people have. And then again, alluding to the aspects that I've laid out before. And I think it works, even in the way that I have developed this Octagon. People tend to have a certain triangle or piece that they most align with. So, for example, myself, I am much more concerned with the economical power that people have rather than the political one. I, as a free marketeer myself, I care way more about how deregulated or how efficient the economy is versus how suffrage works and how the electoral process works and what power the government has politically over its citizens. And I consider myself more in line with caring about the cultural identity, how cultures are preserved and decentralized, and you have these different cultural identities as opposed to the social identity that people might have, where I would not care about my cultural identity and more about being, well, either unique or more conformist in that regard.
Yes. And of course, the shape forms an octagon, and we see these four different pillars. Some people might describe them as four different dimensions, however, they are not non-overlapping dimensions or sort of single point interactive dimensions in the same way that, let's say, the Nolan chart is, where the Nolan chart, you have two axes and they cross over, and then there's expansions of that where there's a third axis which is vertical to the two, and you have a more three-dimensional shape. In this case, what we see is that these dimensions, according to your theory, it seems that they necessarily have a correlation with each other. So somebody that is very strongly centralizing on a particular axis is also likely to centralize on the neighboring axis, generally speaking. And of course, there's obviously places, multiple places where you can go based on how centralization works on these different points, or decentralization, and the different axes. But it seems that, according to this, the four pillars are also interrelated and have correlations with each other. Is that correct?
Yes. So although it's yes, so you do, as you said, you do have some propensity to be more centralized on one spectrum, to also be more uh, centralized on others. And although listing four spectra on a 2D platform is not going to be 100% correct in its assessment, because you can only really align yourself with two spectra, and then the other ones have to be kind of taken with a grain of salt as to how left or right you are on them. You can still generally see yourself being on the left side or the right side of this octagon, so to speak. And if you would take it more literal or more practical, you would probably see the left side and the right side of these spectrums more like stretched out. But I still think people generally can get the idea of how they are positioned and how much it means for their ideology personally.
Yes, and for people that are perhaps interested in seeing how they fall into this spectrum, there is a questionnaire on the website that I will be linking in the description of this video, where you can take the test, and there's also a give feedback section as well. So if perhaps you see a gap in the theory, or you have particular questions about what's going on. I assume that you would be able and willing to answer.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes. So I developed this test around the time that I was also developing this theory, because actually I first wanted to create my own online political test. And I already had some ideas as to how I would like to see a test conducted and how people would be categorized. And that eventually led me to create the Octagon. So it was basically around the same time that I created these two things. And the idea was always going to be that, well, as you might open the questionnaire and you see all the different questions, there are multiple choice questions. Um, you will see right now there are 80 questions and the order is randomized. And you'll see that the first answer of each question is going to be the most left wing or right wing one, and then it will be a gradual spectrum of answers where the next upcoming question will be more left wing or more right wing based on the previous one. And each answer is going to give you a certain score. So right now there are 80 questions, and each answer gives you an amount of points on a certain spectrum. You will have 20 questions that will influence your score on the political spectrum, 20 on the economical one, and so forth. And then these scores will like average out. And if you have then taken the test, you will see your scores. You will see where you are localized on the Octagon. You will see by my theory how left wing you are. There will be an estimation. And you'll see some other stuff too, but that's basically the essence of it. And actually, very important, the last two questions on my test, they will always be at the bottom, is kind of to really see on what triangle do you belong, right? Do you care more about political aspects, or do you care more about economical aspects? Do you care more about cultural or social aspects? Because
Yes.
that's really where it boils down to, right? If I am for a democratic republic, but I'm also for a free market. But I care way more about having a free market than having this democratic republic. I will be more towards the economical spectrum on the right, to all the way towards the privatism words on the Octagon. But if I want a free market, but I don't really care about it, but I really definitely want this democratic republic, you will see me shift more towards the spectrum, the political spectrum, where the democratic republic is listed somewhere.
Yes, and I think it is true that for very many people, they do have their priorities. Some people are very much concerned about economics and not very much about certain other things. So I do think it is true and accurate to make that divide in the priority that people take when they think about politics.
Mhm.
So in comparing your chart to, let's say, the Nolan chart, which is another famous a political compass, a political spectrum idea, what would you say are the defining differences?
Yes. Um, First, I could briefly talk about the way the questionnaire is conducted. I am valiantly against the notion that you will see in the questionnaire of the Nolan chart, where you get a statement put out and you just have to list whether you agree or disagree. You might agree or disagree for different reasons. There's even like a neutral option, which I don't really know could mean anything, given a very specific sentence, how that could do anything for you. So that's the whole reason why I have multiple choice questions, so people can actually make an answer that they actually stand behind, instead of saying they might agree or disagree or be neutral or slightly agree or slightly disagree on very random sentences actually. I know very vividly one of the questions on the Nolan Chart test will be something along the lines of, I believe in human rights. You might agree, you might disagree, you might be neutral, but for what reasons? Then you don't know. I mean, the questionnaire won't know. And then it will try to give you some positioning on some spectrum because of it. And it just doesn't really make sense, in my opinion.
Yes,
And
because
now
there
move.
are very many different theories on human rights and what those are, and of course, also some people might have reactions to certain ideas regarding human rights that they have encountered while not being familiar with other ideas regarding human rights. So, yeah, it does seem to me to be a little bit reductionist in places.
Yes. Yeah. For example, you might not believe in human rights because you are this, I don't know, massive statist and you don't believe your citizens are deserving of any rights. On the other side, you might believe that the concept of human rights is a statist principle where the state now determines that there are certain rights that its individuals must have and you have to be legally obliged to accommodate them with these rights or something along those lines. And those are already like two very different perspectives.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
another idea would be, let's say there's a religious person that has an idea that human rights, rather than being inherent, are instead externally applied from a higher power, and then the question becomes: does that count as being human rights, or is that something different? And and so yes, there are a number of different perspectives on what exactly human rights are.
yes. And
Yeah,
that's just an example, right?
yeah,
But looking at the compass itself, it's just, I think it's horrible. And I think it's tragedy that this is the most known, the most popular form of orienting yourself politically, online at least. So you will see this octagon, and obviously I can see it in front of myself. You have these four quadrants. You have the Arthurian left one, the Arthurian right one, the libertarian left, libertarian right ones, and off the bat, I think the libertarian left quadrant is completely imaginary. I think it doesn't exist in practice. I think even yourself made a video about how anarcho-communism doesn't really have any practical merit to it. I think, if anything, you can take the political compass, the Nolan chart as we know it, just remove the green quadrant, and then just have the the authoritarian left quadrant, then the authoritarian right quadrant in the middle, and then the libertarian right quadrant on the right. But even then, it's sort of sketchy in some regards. And so from left to right, it's supposed to present the economical spectrum. And then from top to bottom, it's the authoritarian libertarian. So I assume state power, state intervention, justification, things like that. But then on the very, very top right point of the whole compass, you would have this completely free market, while at the same time, the state has absolute control over the
over
society.
society. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
And
social access.
yeah. And it's just, again, like, you can't have this. Like, this wouldn't be practically viable. And that's not even to take in all these like memes and connotations that are drawn from certain quadrants, right? Like Nazis are usually presented as the authoritarian right types.
Yeah,
So
even
you
though,
will have the
as far as I'm aware, they tend to really fall more towards the center on the Nolan chart, at least from the analyses that I've seen. Not the actual center, but the up and center authoritarian center, because economically speaking, they did have a more centralized system.
yes,
But
even
of
more.
course, there's a, as you said, with memes and things, there's a sort of reductionist tendency that authoritarian right is the Nazis, even though they're really more on one corner of that, or everybody who's authoritarian is left is a communist, even though there's sort of more social democratic people more towards the center, and the ANCAPs are all libertarian right, even though it's really only a small portion of that on the Nolan chart. So I do think that people that fall into the memes of it tend to also be reductionist. Now, to some extent, I'm pretty sure it is more jocund. I don't think that they're serious. However, I'm pretty sure that there are some people that take the quadrant that they fall in a very serious way, sort of similar to how some people treat astrology.
Yeah.
And of course, that could theoretically happen with any type of political spectrum. But if we're trying to seriously look at political positions and economic positions and things like that, that's something really to be avoided.
Yeah. And I think, okay, so even aside of all the jokes and the memes, which are based on absolute nihilism and nonsense, I think it's still, right, as you said, some people take it still seriously to a large extent, and I believe it's the most mainstream, I mean, it's the most mainstream online political categorization figure. I think it really pollutes the discussion on how politics can be mapped or categorized on a figure. Because, as I said, right, there is no practical basis for half the elements of the whole compass. It makes you believe that you can have, if you look at, like, let's say the very bottom left, again, point of the whole compass, that you can have a society that doesn't have a government whatsoever, but at the same time, the economical power among citizens is absolutely redistributed. Like that doesn't exist. There is zero practical merit to it. So you will have all these people who consider themselves lib left or libertarian left, who say things like, yeah, I don't want the government to do anything to the citizens, or not, like almost nothing. But at the same time, they advocate for heavy regulation, heavy taxation, heavy redistribution, free healthcare, perhaps free housing. It just, like, this is the bulk of the discussion. It's talking about things that don't exist because this mainstream figure makes you believe it's a thing, that it's politically categorizable, which it absolutely isn't.
Yes, and I think another thing that it misses is on some types of detail. For example, I developed a political ideology called Koinonism, and I ended up, it, in order to really place it on a Nolan chart, I ended up having to take the test twice and answer differently, because in Koinonism you have a lot of different policies on a local level to the central level. So I ended up in two completely different positions on the chart, taking it
Yeah.
from the same perspective, but on two different sides of that perspective. And so it certainly is missing some dimensionality.
Yeah.
And of course, there's also, I think another popular test is the 8-axis test.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
are you familiar with that?
oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
You have the 10 groups one, the 9 values, the 8 axis, these GitHub tests that, again, they throw like a number of sentences. And it's funny. So you have 3 different tests, but they, for 90%, they have the exact same questions and the exact same way of answering them. And then they develop these charts. I suppose you cannot bring them up right now, but if you would go to the 10 groups ones, it's it doesn't make sense whatsoever, in my opinion. And they just, I don't know, they just have all these spectrum that really don't really mean anything, right? Whether you're a primitivist or an accelerationist, well, based on what, right? What do you want to accelerate here? I think those are very flawed as well.
Yeah. But one good thing I will say is that they at least they don't have a theory of putting it all on a single map, because I don't think they have a theory on how those would correlate on a single map, and they don't do that. Unlike the Nolan test, which does do that. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's fair. And then of course you have the Lucas North, or whatever the name would be, the site where you can also take test, and has the same chart as it has the Nolan chart, but then in addition, at least it also shows this conservatism, progressivism thingy that at least tries to make a bit more sense of what the Nolan chart does. Although again, it has the same flaws in many ways. And as you point out, at least the 10 groups and the 9 axes and the 8 values test, they don't try to make up this chart and try to fiddle around with it like a single one. So I tried to do both a bit, right? So if you would take the test and you get the results, you will see your score in every single individual spectrum that I have here. In addition, of course, you get your Octagon, which has many dots actually. I show the 4 ideologies that seem to be most closely aligned with what you believe. In addition, you see a single dot on every spectrum individually where you landed, according to those. And then I also have this green dot, which basically tries to intuitively show where you would belong on the octagon, given different metrics that I came up with when I was creating it about 9 months ago. So I try to give as much as I can, given the inputs that I receive with the questions that people answer on my test. Yeah. So not only my charts, also just the spectra individually, and additionally maybe some ideologies that are most closely aligned with you. I even tried to give like this figurehead kind of thing, where if you get results, you will see a person that probably has the same beliefs with one of the spectra that you have a score on. It will be the most extreme spectrum that will be taken into account for that. So even if you don't really care about a free market, but a free market is the most extreme belief that you have given the 4 spectra, you will see. I think it's Mises on my test. So I even tried to take some real life philosophers or economists or whatever into the results. And something I also did more later was you can actually submit your results. Right now, I still have to put the page online where you can then revisit them. It used to be online because I really want to take the nature of online political tests a step further than it is right now, in the sense that people should be able to, construct their society, as it were, given this test, right? If you go to the questionnaire page, on the very top, it says something along the lines of construct your society, the economic aspects of it. How do you view it? How do you want it? The political ones, the social ones, the cultural ones. I give all these questions, and you basically plug in the little details on how you want your society to look like. You get to your results page, you get everything I previously mentioned, and then on the bottom of it, you can actually submit it. You can actually give your ideology a name. You can give it a description, and it will save. And you can go to the database on my site, where you have all the ideologies and their descriptions and their scores listed. And as I said previously, I still have to put the page back up where you can then revisit your results and revisit all the answers you gave. But that's how far I actually want to take it. would like the discussion on political, well, on ideologies and how they interact with society to be to the extent where people can just, instead of saying something along the lines of, oh, I'm out left, I'm lib left, I'm out right, I'm lib right, they can actually say something along the lines of, oh, this would my ideology look like. These ideologies are closely aligned with it. These are the aspects that I like to see in my economy or in my political structure or in the culture that people have in my society, and just take the discussion from there.
Yes, and it certainly sounds very helpful because it would allow people to have a bit of an experimental side of it. Of let's say you hear somebody's positions on some issues and you wonder, well, how does that actually change how they relate to something? So you can perhaps look into that by taking a test and seeing where that aligns. Or if you have particular positions, you could ask yourself, well, who would be most likely to agree with my positions? And you can look into that as well. So I think it is very useful in many ways, and I think it certainly offers a lot more information in relation to those things than the Nolan chart does.
Yeah. And of course, my test exists for like 9 months now. So I've seen it's been posted on Reddit a few times now, and people have given their thoughts a bit. And so one thing that I started seeing from people was the how do I say this, the test that some people have that were able to sort of indulge in their lib left fantasies on the Nolan chart, who can then take my test and see that there doesn't really quite exist something along the lines of not having a government, and at the same time you have heavy taxation and a lot of regulation, right? So I've gotten some criticism from these kind of people. At the same time, a lot of people seem to really like my test. They like the amount of information they're getting from the results page I give them. At the same time, I have a lot of these questions about things I never really thought about. Um, I hope to make a Reddit post in the near future about my test again to say like, hey, I'm Perceval. I revamped my test because I did recently. I added 30 questions to really balance out the amount of questions for each spectrum that there is. And now I even have the feedback option. I have this small Discord server where you can leave your review and you can try to convince me that anarcho-communism is a thing, things like that.
Yeah. So seeing that you say you revamped it, this of course goes into the idea that of course it developed over some time. So tell me, what are some of the setbacks, dead ends, mistakes along the way that you think have been made?
Okay, so I suppose so. So first, let's say around summer last year, when I started to think about all of this, so I started to create all of this. I believe I was not as well. I definitely was not nearly as politically literate as I am now. So I think a lot of the questions or a lot of the answers I made back then were not correct, in the sense that they were giving you scores that they shouldn't be doing. I think a lot of things were very weirdly worded by myself back then. I also, so I had to create this site and everything. Like it's a one-man project. I wasn't quite as skilled in HTML, and I still am not skilled whatsoever in PHP. But I had to kind of squirm myself through making this database where you can revisit previous taken tests. So definitely the programming part was a huge struggle. And also coming up with questions and wording them properly, and making sure that they align properly with my test. Well, so first I had like 20 political questions and only like 7 cultural ones, because it's easier to think about all the different things that might give a government centralized power over something political, over its citizens, as opposed to thinking about all the different questions you can ask about how centralized or decentralized a culture of people can be. So that was also kind of difficult to really balance out these questions. In terms of the revamp, not only did I add questions, I also restructured the theory page you can see on the site, because I had some inconsistencies in what words I was using. So I tried to define the concept of having a democratic republic as republicism. And sometimes I would instead use the word republicanism, which obviously is something else. It's more related to the Republican Party of the US. So I had to really weave out these terminology inconsistencies along the way. Not only on the text that you can see on the side, but also the imagery that I'm using. Now, this Octagon, it's actually created in Excel. And then it's taken from Excel to Paint, where I added the different words a bit better and such. So there was also has gone a lot of work into those. They're essentially pixel perfect when it comes to how the coloring should be and how the names of everything should be located on them, which wasn't quite hard. It was just tedious to really edit these images, because the ideologies one that you can see on the main page, it's like 4,500 pixels wide, and again around 4,000 pixels in height. So I had to do a lot of image editing. As I said previously, I had to do a lot of programming. I had to do a lot of structuring the questions and their answers, and making them not only obviously grammatically correct, but also correct in, is this really the extreme left-wing position to this question? Is this the center left-wing position, right? Like, take the right positions on these questions, make sure they make sense, make sure that people understand what they're saying. Like, sometimes I will have a term and then I have to describe what it means and brackets behind it on my questionnaire. But generally speaking, the idea of the Octagon was pretty much already there in the beginning. I already had like the 4-pillar theory, having these 4 pillars as 4 spectrums, was something I always believed in from the start, basically. So at least the concept was always there, and it was never hard to come up with it. It kind of just went well. It kind of came by itself. Also, the coloring, I basically made some notes about what sections should have what colors, right? Like the status one, I wanted to give it a red color. The economical decentralization part, I wanted to give it a yellow color. And I just made some notes like this, and then by itself, it kind of got this like rainbow coloring, which I think looks pretty solid. Gives it its flavor, you could say. You can even see the favicon on the side, on top of your browser. I put the little octagon there. Now, you can also see on the results page the different segments or alignments on the octagon, where you can see all the different kinds of left wing and right wing and center wing. These, I have not developed these concepts. They're actually from a person who I have met almost 2 years ago in a political server, who was really educating me on all the different kinds of left wing and right wing there are in the whole political sphere. And then when I developed the octagon, I first showed the empty one, and then he basically determined that you can map all these alignments in there, and then the ideologies are still by myself, the ones on the home screen. And yes, I have to obviously explain everything and make sure that I have that I am consistent with all the words that I use. Again, also on the images, which hasn't always been easy. I try to define everything as well as I can, although I also try to keep my definitions concise, so they're not like books on or whatever, or like multiple pages. Um, yeah, so that's kind of been how it has been, the whole development, all the way from having this idea of creating my own online test, along with the four spectrums that I have always believed in, all the way to what I have made now on this online site. Something more recently, only really from the end of last year, is the idea that you can see on the very bottom of the theory page. I think I refer to it as the extensions of the left wing and the right wing.
Yes, and that was going to be my next question to you. What is your left-right theory? Now, of course, you had mentioned to me earlier. I of course have my own left-right theory. Now, of course, I will say that my theory on popular sovereignty versus hierarchy sovereignty as being the left and right elements of politics in that sense, that is specifically to a particular context. And I will say that left and right are typologies. It's a taxonomy. It's something that is used to describe something that is real, but that in itself is not a real quality in that sense. So there's a lot of arbitrariness and definition making in order to determine what we are ontologically referring to as left and right. So I will emphasize to people that left versus right, the left-right spectrum is something that is based on the definitions that you use to define it, and that therefore I wouldn't say that there is an absolutely 100% exclusively correct way to do this. It's just that there's multiple different perspectives. Wouldn't you agree to that?
100%.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's just a theory that I have, the
Yeah.
four-pillar theory, and then everyone. You also made, your video about your theory on how it could be defined, and I suppose other people have their own.
Yeah, but what about your particular theory of left and right? I'm going to show the how the left-right spectrum maps to your octagon with the extended wings. That's the image I'm showing right now.
Oh yes. Yeah, the extension part is something I came up with way later, because I was thinking about, so for example, the political spectrum at the very, very, very right end of it. It would essentially be something where governments are privatized, where there is no state in the sense that people will have to vote for it, and it will have control over the area, and people will have to pay tax in voluntary. So when you privatize governments, and it's optional for people to and engage in a contract with those, then you're basically talking about economical power in a sense. So then I basically developed this idea of, like, if you are at the very, very right wing end of the political spectrum, it's basically merged into the economical spectrum. And I tend to see the same thing happen on the identity spectrums, where if you decentralize cultures enough, and this is where I take usage of the concept of Dunbar's number. I'm not necessarily sure if you're familiar with the concept. So
Could you
Dunbar's number.
explain it
Oh,
just so
yes.
that everybody understands?
Yeah, you're right. So Dunbar's number, it's a concept developed by this, I think he's an anthropologist who went by the name Dunbar. He developed this. Basically, it's the a maximum amount of stable social relationships that a human being can have at a time. And basically, I use it here in a sense of, okay, you decentralized a culture enough to the point where you have a locality of, let's say, 150. So okay, so Dunbar's number tends to be between 100 and 250, if I remember correctly. So let's say that amount of people who live in some isolated locality, they could have their own culture. At that point, the social identity of the individuals is very determinant of the local culture. So, for example, I am from the Netherlands, I'm Dutch. If I were to die tomorrow, it would have absolutely zero impact on the Dutch culture. Most Dutch people won't even know that I died. But if you live in this small locality of, let's say, 100 to 200 people, if you, as one of the elders who has maintained the traditions within that locality, dies, like that will have an impact on the culture, on the traditions that are being held in this locality. So that person's social identity, his skills, his opinions, his hobbies, whatever, actually have an impact on the culture. So at the very, very, very right wing side of the cultural spectrum, it essentially merges into the social one as well. So basically, uh, and to make this, to show this on the 2D figure, the octagon that I use is kind of tricky, but essentially you'll have to look at it as if only the economic and the social spectrum really matter when you go beyond the octagon in terms of being right wing, because the cultural one identity merged into the social identity, and the political power merged into the economical power. Um, it's still highly theoretical, and I mean, it doesn't really concern anything that I know of that exists. It's just some theoretical notion that I have thought about more recently.
Yes,
And the
but
flip side, uh,
that's just the extremes of that, the beyond extremes of that. But
yeah,
I think that what you're saying is that the spectrum, of course, is that on the left everything is a lot more centralized, and on the right everything is a lot more decentralized. And then the spectrum, the left right spectrum, is centralization versus decentralization. Is that correct?
yes, that's essentially the name of the game here. The more right wing you go culturally, the more you want individuals to have different decentralized cultures in whatever society you have. The more on the economic spectrum, the more right wing you go on the economic spectrum, the more you want to deregulate, to have businesses, for example, determine their own policies instead of the state demanding minimum wage, for example. The more right wing you go on the social spectrum, the more you try to respect different opinions and expressions and forms of speech. The more right wing you go on the political spectrum, the more you want to have individuals or groups or smaller forms of government decides legislation instead of having like one federal centralized government determine everything. And of course, the flip side happens for the left wing. Want more centralized, well, government, for example, to dictate more, to have less input from all the different citizens that are gathered across society. More left wing economy, obviously, more regulation, more centralized planning, potentially, more policy determination in regards to economic policies. The left wing social spectrum, that so the more left wing on the social spectrum, you are more in favor of censoring the opinions of people that the mob doesn't agree with. You might want to demonize people. You might want to even deport or perform an expulsion on them in the most extreme cases. And of course, the left wing on the cultural spectrum, the more left wing you go, the more you try to mix different cultures, the more you try to have this idea that people of different cultures can like merge into a more centralized culture. You might believe that culture isn't as important, or decentralizing them or keeping them apart isn't as important, things like that. So those tend to be the tendencies of going both sides of these four spectrums.
Yes. So how would this compare then to, let's say, the more pop culture spectrum of the Marxist Leninists being on the far left and the Nazis and fascists being on the far right, with liberal democracy being in between? How would that shape in relation to your four pillars theory?
Yeah. So if I would take the most widely real life used spectrum, um, first, I don't really believe that the Nazis were right wingers, and definitely not extremely right wingers, as a lot of the economic and social policies they had were highly centralized and left wing. Like basically, right now, you can have a communist, literal communist, and if that person would appear to be an extreme racist, then people will call him extremely right wing just because he's a racist, which I believe doesn't have any merit to any intellectual theory or discourse.
Yeah, and to be fair,
Um,
there were some communists who were very racist.
yeah, yeah, and what are they then, right? Far right. So I believe the spectrum is definitely more improved, the one-dimensional, most used one. If you just consider the spectrum ranging from communism all the way to, let's say, anarcho-capitalism. But what you essentially have right here is probably something along the lines of only the economical spectrum, maybe the social spectrum still in addition to that, where again you have more economic freedom, probably more social freedom as you move along from communism to anarcho-capitalism. Um, so you would probably relate it more to the two um, spectrums that I use in my Octagon, the social and the economical one. Probably also the political one to some extent, but for example, the cultural one, you cannot really make any reference to it in the one-dimensional spectrum. I don't like. I believe you will have a lot of inconsistencies with what people believe. Um, so again, so it's obviously it's going to be more reductionist if you only have one dimension to go by.
Yes, and I believe
And
that this is probably one of the reasons why the Nolan chart was developed in the first place. It's because just having a universal one dimensional spectrum is very reductionist, because whereas there is a mainstream politically that in a society you can call the center, there is many different ways to reach extremes from that, and reducing all those different directions to just a one-dimensional spectrum is it leads to a situation where you have to really prioritize only one type of information. Otherwise it becomes really confusing.
yes, I could also elaborate a bit more on the center wing of my octagon.
Yeah.
So you will have in the middle, like just if you look at it from top to bottom, you will have the center wing, which ranges from the absolute center, which would hold ideologies such as an absolute monarchy, all the way to the unicenter, which would take more of a universalist approach. Where basically in this center, the socio-economic factors of the society are to be had in the middle of the spectrums. You will probably have some mixed economy, perhaps some populist social characteristics and how individuals of society interact with each other. But then the question, of course, is this status quo held or maintained by authoritarian measures, right? And that's when you go up, right? You have the Auf center, so the more authoritarian part of the center, or even more authoritarian, where, in my opinion, you get into the alt-right territory, where you try to go, you might even go further authoritarian. You try to militarize and have this police state to keep this centrist policy on socioeconomic factors like stable. Or you might go the universalist approach, where you have the classical center, which holds ideologies such as the classical democracy that you had in Greece, or you just try to have some communitarian approach, some universalist approach, where you try to mishmash a lot of different ideologies together and try to have some centrist pasta that makes everyone happy. That's the idea here. And I think this is a way better representation of what a third way could look like the going authoritarian in the center wing is what I consider to be the third way, as we call it in politics, right? You're not going left wing or right wing necessarily on the octagon. You're just keeping in the middle, but you're still going in direction, which,
Yeah.
the third direction then.
Yeah. So I would say, in my opinion, that it is, as far as I can tell, a very useful theory that certainly has a lot more detail than many of the others that I've seen, and also allows you to really compare things in a better way than, let's say, the 8-axis, 9 values type theories. So in that sense, I would say it's very useful. Now, of course, over time, I'm sure that a number of different people will take the test, and we might see larger data trends emerging, and we will see whether it stands the test of time, whether it will be revised, or whether a new, more accurate theory emerges. But nevertheless, I will say that it certainly seems to me that you have done an excellent job.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have come across most of the things that we wanted to talk about. Is there anything else in particular that you would like to state in relation to your theory?
Well, first, of course, as I've said before, at the end of the day, it's just a theory. I don't take it as an absolute truth, right? I have to state my own definitions and build on that, my own basis. And any person is free to discuss any points of criticism or any type of feedback. Of course, my test is linked in the description, and people can give me the feedback if they go to the site and go to the Discord link and can join the server there that I specifically set up for my test, and people can go enter it. People can engage in discourse with me on anything regarding the theory. I just hope to try to reach out to more people online with my test and my theory and my ideas on how politics can be discussed, not only on the geopolitical factors of what happens in the news, not even necessarily about deep political theory or manifestos, but simply just people trying to think about how they want a society to look like, construct that, and discuss all the different ideas, all the different aspects that go along with it, all the different cultural, social, economical, and political things you have to think about when you try to imagine how you want a society to look like. And yeah, I hope to take that step and make some evolution happen on how politics is being discussed, primarily online, of course. And yeah, for that reason, I will try to keep developing my site and my theory if I see any holes or gaps that I have to fill. And of course, any person is free to just discuss the whole thing with me.
Okay. I think it's very good to have someone that is very open to discussion to these things, and I do believe that these types of topics about politics are very important to talk about, especially in a time period where it seems that the currently existing systems are being questioned by a number of people. So I think it is important to understand where we are, where we're going, and where we could go. And I see you as someone that is helping society today answer these questions. So that's very good. So is there anything else you'd like to plug? Anything you'd like people to know about before we conclude?
Um, I don't believe so. The only thing I'd like to say is try my test, and if you have feedback, I'd like to hear it. That's all I have to say.
Yes. So anyway, thank you all for watching. It's been great having you on to talk about your test and your theory. I think that in the future there may be a lot more potential points of discussion in relation to this as more information emerges. But I look forward to seeing how this venture plays out. So anyway, I would like to thank our beautiful audience for watching. It's been great having you as well. If you have any questions for me or would like to show up on my show, feel free to comment in the comments section below, and we might be able to get in contact and arrange that. And of course, the test and the associated theory are in the comments section below. Feel free to take the test and see where you line up politically. In fact, I would encourage you to do so. Even if you disagree, I think, with the results, I think it will help us understand more the nature of the test as well as the nature of politics nowadays. So anyway, I've been Anavultus, and I will be seeing you all next time. Over and out.